Communication has always been a fundamental part of human civilization. From ancient smoke signals to handwritten letters carried by messengers, humans have sought ways to connect across distances. But everything changed with one groundbreaking invention, the telephone. Today, we'll explore the incredible journey of how the telephone was invented, how it evolved over time, and how it ultimately led to the creation of the first smartphone. Before the telephone, the most advanced and widely used form of long-distance communication was the telegraph. Invented in the early 19th century, the telegraph completely transformed how people shared information. For the first time, messages could travel hundreds or even thousands of miles in a matter of minutes rather than days or weeks, as with traditional letters. The telegraph worked by sending electrical signals through wires, using a system known as Morse code, a series of dots and dashes that had to be manually encoded and decoded by trained operators. It was a revolutionary step forward, but it had significant limitations. Messages could only be transmitted as text, requiring telegraph stations and intermediaries to send and receive them. There was no way to communicate instantly using spoken words, which meant that conversations were still slow and indirect. As technology advanced, scientists and inventors began to ask an exciting question. What if we could go beyond simple coded messages? What if, instead of tapping out signals, we could transmit the human voice itself, allowing people to speak to each other across vast distances in real time? This idea seemed like science fiction at the time, but a handful of brilliant minds set out to turn it into reality. Their experiments would lead to one of the greatest inventions in history, the telephone. The race to invent the telephone was filled with competition and innovation. Throughout the mid-19th century, several inventors across the world were independently working on ways to transmit voice electronically. Scientists and engineers understood that sound was simply a vibration that traveled through air. So, in theory, it could also be converted into electrical signals and sent through wires, just like the telegraph transmitted coded messages. But actually, making this idea work was far more complex than anyone had imagined. Among the many inventors attempting to solve this challenge, one name would rise above the rest: Alexander Graham Bell. Bell, a Scottish-born inventor and a teacher for the deaf, had always been fascinated by sound and speech. His father and grandfather were both experts in phonetics and communication, and Bell himself had spent years developing techniques to help hearing-impaired individuals communicate more effectively. His work with the deaf gave him a unique perspective on sound, inspiring him to explore how it could be transformed into an electrical signal. In the 1870s, Bell was researching ways to improve the telegraph, which at the time could only send one message at a time. He envisioned a system that could transmit multiple messages simultaneously, a concept he called the harmonic telegraph. However, as his research progressed, Bell became increasingly convinced that he could take this technology even further. Instead of just sending coded signals, what if he could send the human voice itself? With the help of his dedicated assistant, Thomas Watson, Bell spent years testing different methods to convert sound vibrations into electrical signals and then reproduce them at a distant receiver. They experimented tirelessly, creating and modifying various mechanical and electrical components, but for a long time, their efforts were met with frustration. Then, on March 10th, 1876, history was made. While working in his Boston laboratory, Bell accidentally spilled acid on his clothes. In a moment of panic, he called out to Watson, who was in another room. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." To his amazement, Watson rushed into the room, not because he heard Bell shouting through the walls, but because he had heard his voice transmitted through the device they had been building. The experiment had worked. For the first time in human history, a spoken message had been successfully transmitted and received over a wire. It was a breakthrough that changed the world forever. Shortly after this success, Bell patented his invention, securing his place in history as the father of the telephone. But his work was just the beginning. His invention would spark a revolution in global communication, connecting people in ways never before imagined. After Alexander Graham Bell's groundbreaking invention, the telephone quickly began to spread, changing the way people communicated forever. However, in the early days, using a telephone was not as simple as dialing a number. Instead, it required the assistance of switchboard operators, who played a crucial role in connecting calls. When someone wanted to reach another person, they would first have to call the local telephone exchange, where an operator would manually plug a cable into the correct line to establish the connection. This process was time-consuming, but it was still far faster and more efficient than sending a letter or telegram. As the demand for telephone services grew, so did the need for a more extensive network. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, telephone lines had expanded rapidly, stretching across cities, countries, and even continents. More and more businesses and households began installing telephones, and the device became an essential tool for communication. Recognizing the massive potential of this new technology, Bell founded the Bell Telephone Company in 1877. This company would go on to revolutionize the telecommunications industry, eventually evolving into AT&T, one of the most influential companies in history. With continuous innovation, the telephone network became more advanced, and the reliance on operators began to decrease. By the early 20th century, automated switching systems allowed people to dial numbers directly, eliminating the need for manual connections. This development sped up communication and made telephones even more accessible to the general public. What started as an experimental invention had now become a global necessity, setting the stage for the modern communication networks we rely on today. Throughout the 20th century, the telephone underwent major transformations, making communication faster, easier, and more accessible to people around the world. One of the biggest advancements came with the rotary dial phone, which eliminated the need for operators to manually connect calls. Instead of relying on switchboards, users could now dial numbers directly by rotating a circular dial with numbered holes. This innovation sped up the calling process and made using the telephone more convenient than ever. As technology advanced, so did the design and functionality of telephones. In the 1960s, the rotary dial was replaced by the push-button phone, which allowed people to dial numbers much faster and with greater precision. This new system used tone dialing instead of pulses, which paved the way for even more advanced telephone networks. But the biggest revolution was still to come. In the 1980s and 1990s, the world witnessed the rise of mobile phones, breaking the chains of traditional landlines. No longer confined to a cord, people could now make calls from virtually anywhere. At first, these early mobile phones were large, heavy, and extremely expensive, making them a luxury item only available to a select few. But as the technology improved, mobile phones became smaller, more affordable, and widely available, transforming them into an essential part of everyday life. This shift marked the beginning of a new era, one where communication was no longer limited to a fixed location, but could happen anytime, anywhere. But the biggest leap in telephone history came in 1992, when IBM introduced the first real smartphone, the IBM Simon. Unlike any phone before it, Simon was more than just a device for making calls. It featured a touchscreen, could send emails and faxes, and even had basic apps like a calendar and a notepad. Though bulky and ahead of its time, the IBM Simon laid the foundation for what would eventually become the modern smartphone. As technology progressed, mobile phones became smaller, faster, and more powerful. But nothing would shake the industry quite like the arrival of the iPhone in 2007. Developed by Apple, the iPhone introduced a sleek, button-free design, an intuitive touchscreen interface, and, most importantly, full internet connectivity, allowing people to browse the web, download apps, and communicate in ways never seen before. It wasn't just a phone, it was a revolution. This moment redefined the way we interact with technology, setting the stage for the smartphones we rely on today. From Bell's first telephone to the powerful smartphones we carry in our pockets today, the journey of the telephone is one of the most incredible technological advancements in history. It has transformed the way we communicate, bringing people together across continents in ways that Bell himself could have never imagined. And as technology continues to evolve, who knows what the future holds? Maybe one day we'll communicate using holograms or brain-to-brain interfaces. The possibilities are endless. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the history of everyday inventions.